Welcome to Movie Briefs. Today's spoiler is a 2016 romantic science fiction drama film titled Passengers. Here come the spoilers. Enjoy and be safe. The Avalon, an interplanetary spaceship, is seen zipping through space on its way to a conquered planet referred to as Homestead 2. The ship's on autopilot with all cabins empty. There are 5,000 passengers and 258 crew members currently hibernating. The ship's shields are suddenly weakened as it travels through a ring of asteroids. Despite the ship's best efforts to shift power to its primary shield, it is heading straight for a gigantic space asteroid. The ship suffers multiple breakdowns after the asteroid suddenly crashes into it. The ship starts self-repairs, but a pod wakes up from hibernation. Jim Preston, a mechanical engineer, was the awakened passenger. When his pod opens, an AI greets him and tells him it's time to wake up. AI says he spent 120 years in cryogenic sleep and is only 4 months from Homestead. The AI assures him that he can spend his time indulging in the ship's many high-end amenities. Jim is briefed on his ID band, cabin, and the primary tasks he'll be tasked with during his time at the base. To have a hand in operation before the ship lands on the planet. Leaving his cabin, both excited and anxious to meet the other passengers, he prepares himself and enters a robotic classroom designed to teach a whole class at once. Jim appears concerned as the hologram describes the crisis on Earth. Overcrowded and overpriced. Jim is constantly asking questions, though the AI warns him not to ask questions until the end of the class. He's alone in the room. As he comes to terms with the hologram's inability to respond, he leaves in search of human company. Soon, he finds himself in the ship's central atrium. However, there is an automated information desk that can answer questions if you need it. Jim presses the human button, and the system routes him to the steward service desk. Jim discovers that no one else is present. He approaches the captain and requests a meeting. Even though he is unable to enter the bridge, he is able to observe what is going on inside. To the fact that none of the primary crew members are present either. In the end, Jim makes it to the observatory, where he learns that the spacecraft is actually years away from destination. Homestead 2 is still 90 years away. Aware that he awoke too soon, he returns to the terminal and quickly transmits a message back to Earth for advice, as he is clueless on how to reactivate the hibernation pod after waking up. According to the communications system, the expensive call to Earth would take around 55 years to get a reply. Jim is inconsolable. The only other person he encounters during his explorations is in the ship's bar. His conversation with the bartender is weird. When Jim gets a drink, he discovers that the man is not human but an android. Arthur is the name of it. Jim is eager to learn from him, but he lacks the language skills to adequately explain his situation to an android. Jim is in a messed up situation. The next morning, Jim gets up in his cabin and heads to the cantina, where he has a shocking realization. That the majority of the food and drink options are only available to those who have paid for the highest service level, gold. He makes himself a cup of black coffee and tries to think of a solution to the problem with his hibernation space. He gathers the necessary equipment, gets it running, and then lays down inside the pod. Yet, nothing occurs. He then makes up his mind to break into the crew's hibernation chambers using the tools he discovered. Neither of those options are viable. A number of minor problems have been occurring across the ship. Jim is obviously a fan of the bar, but he continues coming back for one reason: Arthur. After receiving some guidance from the robot, he decides to break into a gold suite and do his best to relax while at sail. Jim has tried every amenity available, including eateries, games, and the like. In fact, the longer he is trapped there, the more miserable he becomes. After a night of drinking and aimless wandering about the hibernation pods, he finds himself spacewalking specific airlock equipment. Jim puts on a spacesuit and proceeds to the airlock, where he opens it by first pressing a lever and then the button to a hatch in order to gain access to the outer space. When he steps away from the ship, he is taken aback by the scenery. Only he is aware of this particular instant in time. Jim, feeling utterly hopeless, removes the magnets from his boots and floats aimlessly through space. When he gets back inside, he removes the suit but re-enters the airlock without it. He's about to pull the trigger and end it all when he had a change of heart and instead sprints away. Comes back inside and trips over a bottle. When Jim gets to his feet, he can't help but notice Aurora, a woman in one of the pods. He goes through the directory looking for her records and ends up being obsessed with the passenger interview she gave. Completely smitten with her. He is later spotted while still listening to her interviews while sitting next to her pod. He has taken some of her writing with him to the bar, where he and Arthur are discussing it. He can't stop thinking about the absurdity of his predicament, which is that he's leaving Earth in search of a better life on another planet. Daily routine, including waking up early but still being late, meeting the woman of his dreams only to have her reject him, and finding himself in a situation where it's impossible to attain. Jim can't stop thinking about her, and he eventually gets the need to wake her up. He discusses it with the android, but they both remain perplexed. He'd be leaving her for dead if he woke her up for his own comfort. At first, Jim rejects the idea, but as time passes, he finds he can't shake it. Until he had a change of heart. He visits her capsule and switches it on. During the time that she is awakening and going through the same process that he did, he sneaks back to the place he was hiding. A few while later, he makes his way down to the main hall in search of her. There she is, as bewildered as he was a year ago. When she asks if anyone else is awake, Jim says that they are the only ones and takes her to the observatory. Then he tells her that he is cut off from the ship's crew and the primary controls. Having a panic attack, Aurora desperately wants to return to her pod. When they reach there, Jim lets them know that the spacecraft isn't equipped with anything that can aid them in entering hibernation once again, thus conveying to her the reality that they are stranded. They return to the lobby, where he advises that, given how recently she arrived, she should get some sleep. Coming out of a long hibernation, having to spend over a year alone on the ship, she pities him. Jim heads back to the bar area, regretting his decision. He begs Arthur to keep it from Aurora that he was the one to wake her up. Aurora is awake the following morning. She returns to the lobby and inquires at the self-service information desk about the hibernation pods. Jim follows her to the restaurant where she is having breakfast. The malfunction occurs as they are leaving the information desk. Aurora notices that Jim has been eating the same breakfast at the cantina for a while. After a year, he is entitled to a menu reserved for the first-class section. They discuss the possibility of repairing the pods, but Aurora isn't enthusiastic about it like Jim is. She thinks it's a futile effort. She begins her quest in the hospital's infirmary, where she conducts her research. To the crew's hibernation quarters and attempting to force their way in. Even additional problems with the ship have been brought to Jim's attention. Aurora later reflects on her miserable existence on Avalon. While becoming increasingly self-aware through her writing, jogging, and swimming, and her current predicament, she decides to meet Jim in the cantina for an interview since she thinks his life story will be fascinating. She wants to know what drew him to the colony. Jim responds with a couple of buzzwords at first, but goes on to explain that he got on board so he could make a name for himself and start a fresh life in the new world. Later, when they've arrived at the observatory, Aurora will explain why she's there. She is the only passenger on the ship with a return ticket. Her plan was to spend a year in Homestead 2 becoming self-sufficient, and then return to Earth. As a journalist who did that for the first time, creating the greatest story ever told. Aurora eventually stops trying to find a solution to their current predicament, and Jim tries to find something to make her feel better. He shows her a good time at the movies, on the dance floor, and on the court. Ultimately, he brings her to the bar to meet Arthur the android. She begins to unwind until she is reminded of their predicament. Alone with the android, Jim can't help but feel guilty about what he's done to her. Later, Jim is seen fiddling with something. He reveals the Chrysler building model he built especially for her. Later, on a date, they head to the bar. They sit down for dinner and talk about their days. As a teen, she opens out to him about the loss of her father. At the conclusion of supper, Jim leads Aurora to the airlock, where the two of them put on spacesuits. A spacewalk is undertaken by the pair. At long last, Jim has someone with whom to share that amazing event. Jim disengages their boots' magnets, and they float through space together. Upon their return inside, they embrace passionately before going to sleep in his cabin. They begin acting like a couple almost immediately. Aurora takes up residence in his cabin and documents her experiences as a writer. They eat and sleep all together. Jim continues his voyage of discovery and locates the ship's hydroponics bay. He presents flowers to Aurora. They visit the observatory when the ship flies by a red giant star. Later that night, they celebrate Aurora's birthday at one of the ship's many eateries within the confines of the ship, followed by a trip to the bar. While Aurora rests, Jim goes to the bathroom to polish the ring he crafted for her. Sitting at the bar chit-chatting with Arthur, Aurora is told by the robot that Jim awakened her up on purpose, not realizing he shouldn't have revealed what he said. Now that Jim's secret is out of the bag. All of a sudden, Jim reappears, and Aurora confronts him in complete shock. She storms off, angry and terrified. Once Jim returns to his cabin, he discovers that she has removed all of her belongings. The following day, he encounters her in the cantina, but as soon as he talks, she bolts. Aurora needs help badly at this point. As she plots Jim's murder, she visits his cabin one night and begins punching and kicking him. Jim tries to apologize and explain himself to her over the comm because she keeps avoiding him. She felt he took advantage of her for his selfish reason. Aurora is uninterested in his declaration of love. Since he was responsible for her death, she has no ability to forgive him. While Jim is in his cabin one night, another failure occurs, and the ship's control center has gone dark. He enters the elevator, and it breaks down. When Aurora enters the main hall, she notices that Jim has planted a tree in the middle of the floor. Then she tries the cantina, but the food dispenser is broken there. At that moment, the deck chief's voice comes over the comms, demanding to know who planted the tree. As they enter the concourse, they spot Gus Mancuso near Jim's tree. They formally introduce themselves to the chief and explain the current situation. When told that 3 pods failed, he just doesn't get it. Mancuso leads them up to the bridge, where he notices something is awry. However, it is necessary to verify the data on the systems by hand. As they go off the bridge, a robot nearly topples over on them, and they share their story. Mancuso notices that more problems are cropping up all over the ship. While demonstrating how to gather the information, he assures them that the malfunctions shouldn't have occurred. When Jim comes to check on the pods, Mancuso is already there. He has determined what happened to Aurora's spacecraft. The captain of the ship thinks that what Jim did is bad. He checks the statistics later on the bridge with Aurora by his side. They discuss what happened to her pod, but he explains that there's nothing he can do to reverse the situation. Jim enters carrying the 16th damaged robot. Mancuso gets the hibernation sickness and goes to rest, but as he's leaving, he coughs, exuding blood. Aurora has trouble sleeping that night, so she decides to go for a swim. There was a sudden loss of gravity over the entire ship, and she began to drown as the water began to rise. As she fled, the swimming pool followed her. She nearly escapes when the gravity drive is restarted. They meet on the way to find Mancuso. Now that all 3 of them have returned to the bridge, they can begin to piece together what has happened. Mancuso discovers that a critical system was disabled 2 years ago due to an event. All of the ship's systems are currently straining to function, so it's imperative that they determine and rectify the root cause of the problem. To fill in the gaps. It's critical that they fix it, or the whole ship will be stranded. Mancuso passes out while they investigate, so Jim and Aurora have to rush him to the medical cabin. There is nothing that can be done to save his life or even slow down his demise. Mancuso finally hands Jim his bracelet during a later meeting with the trio in the observatory. After the bracelet transfer, the captain requests repairs of the ship, and then dies instantly. The lights flash a terrifying shade of red, and the ship begins to shake violently. Jim calls out to Aurora for her aid and the 2 of them race towards the engineering cabin, but on the way, they encounter another problem with the gravity drive. And right away there's a second problem, this time with Arthur. Jim turns off his power. Once they reached the engineering department, they began investigating the issue. Aurora is sucked in as they open the hatch to the compartment after finding out the power plant damage to the hull in that area has been caused by the asteroid. Jim is drawn in, but he manages to cling to the hatch as it closes more and more tightly around him. A while later, he is sucked in, but they are able to quickly close the hole. Immediately upon resolving that issue, Jim sees that there is more than one hole in the hull. They trace the meteor's path and determine it struck the reactor, as they commanded the machine. They tracked down the component and swapped it out, but the reactor still can't be vented. Again, they resort to doing it by hand, but it ends up failing. Eventually, Jim figures out that he needs to be outside of the ship in order to open the vent door, and the 2 of them are able to stay alive. They try to lower the reactor's temperature. They head to the airlock, and as he prepares to exit, he hands Aurora Mancuso's bracelet because he may never return. She battles the thought of losing him. Then, as he enters the airlock, she yells for him to return, having helped him put on the suit, because she needs him desperately to survive on the ship. Aurora returns to the reactor, which is now at a dangerously high temperature. A bolt flies out and slams into her arm. Jim views from the outside and notices the entrance. As he tries to get past the vent door, the temperature in the reactor room climbs. He tries to get it open. He quickly learns that in order for the reactor to vent, he will have to manually prop open the door, as well as informs Aurora of this fact. She disagrees with the proposal, but he insists that she opens the reactor's air vents nevertheless. They dispute because she doesn't want him to die and he insists they have to save the ship and others in it, and she opens the reactor's safety valve. It works, but Jim's bond is severed when the reactor's fumes drive him away. In addition, his suit's pressure is beginning to drop. He explains the situation to Aurora, and she quickly changes into a different suit. She tries to usher him inside. He offers his condolences once more. She puts on a flying suit in an attempt to rescue him, but her tether is too short. She is pushed away, but she grabs onto his tether and brings him in. Despite Aurora's best efforts, the medical AI sadly pronounced Jim dead upon arrival. She bypasses the standard operating procedures by using Mancuso's bracelet to revive him. Jim's life is brought back by the medical pod, which operates fully automatically. Later, after Aurora has fixed Arthur, the two of them give Mancuso a decent space burial. Jim brings her to the hospital, where he reveals that he's figured out how to put the hibernation pod to use. They still have 9 decades to get to travel destination. He instructs her to enter the capsule and remain there for the remaining duration of the trip. The truth, however, is that she refuses and instead chooses to remain awake aboard the ship with him. In the end, Jim pops the question, and the two decide to spend the rest of their lives together aboard ship. The Avalon reaches Homestead 2 after 88 years. The ship's crew awakens to an unusual situation. Aurora sends them a note in which she recounts her and Jim's time spent on the ship, while everyone else was sound asleep. Please like and subscribe if you want more videos like this. Enjoy and be safe.